You will hear many stories about Tom Raudonikis. They will sound exaggerated, embellished, and sometimes totally unbelievable. But trust me, they're all true. Tom came into big-time rugby league during the 60s and 70s. It was a tough and violent era back then. But to say Tommy was very comfortable in that environment would be a massive understatement. He revelled in it. He was a fierce combatant, a raw, passionate, unapologetic competitor. He feared no one. He would never take a backward step.
How good was Tom Raudonikis? That's the question Ray Warren and Wayne Bennett were asked, and their answers couldn't have been more different. Warren saw a tribal warrior who gave rugby league its soul. Bennett saw a coach stuck in the past who relied on chaos instead of systems. And that split tells you everything about Tommy. He was the most competitive player the sport had ever seen, but his methods were so extreme that you couldn't imagine them happening today. This is what happens when the biggest names in NRL history are forced to explain a man who built his career on violence, loyalty, and a refusal to ever back down. A man who turned psychological warfare into an art form and made entire teams believe they could win through sheer aggression alone. A man whose name still triggers arguments decades after he stopped playing. Before we go further, do me a favor and use the hype feature on this video. It helps the channel grow and lets me keep bringing you stories like this. Just one click and we can keep digging into the legends who shaped the game. Tom Raudonikis didn't come from rugby league royalty. He came from a migrant camp in Cowra. His family arrived from Lithuania and Switzerland in the 1950s, when Australia expected new arrivals to blend in quietly and cause no trouble. But the Raudonikis family didn't do quiet. They lived on Tarragala Street in Cowra, and young Tom was taught by Mother Scholastica at St. Raphael's. She didn't preach forgiveness. She preached competition. She told him that turning the other cheek was weakness, and that stuck with him for life. It wasn't just religious instruction. It was a philosophy that would define every tackle, every punch, every moment he spent on a rugby league field. By 1967, he joined the Royal Australian Air Force and trained as an aircraft frame fitter. That gave him discipline, the kind of technical precision you need when you're working on aircraft. But it also gave him something else, an understanding that systems could be manipulated, that rules existed to be bent, and that authority was only as strong as your willingness to challenge it. Then he played for the Wagga Kangaroos in the Riverina, and that gave him violence. Not the mindless kind, but the calculated kind. The kind that sent a message before the ball was even kicked. The kind that made opponents think twice about running at you. When he debuted for the Western Suburbs Magpies in 1969, he was already a fully formed weapon. He walked into first grade and immediately knocked over Arthur Summons's team. It was symbolic. The old guard was done. The era of finesse and gentlemen's agreements was over. Tommy was here, and he brought the Western Suburbs with him. The real shift happened when Roy Masters became his coach at Wests. Masters wasn't just a coach. He was a psychologist who weaponized class warfare. He looked at the Western Suburbs of Sydney and saw fibro houses, factory workers, and migrants grinding through 60-hour weeks just to keep the lights on. Then he looked at the northern beaches and saw Manly Silvertails living in brick homes with ocean views, trust funds, and private school educations. Masters branded the Magpies as fibros and told them every game was a war between the working class and the elite. It wasn't just marketing. It became the team's entire identity. The narrative gave them permission to play dirty because in their minds, they were fighting for something bigger than a trophy. They were fighting for respect, for recognition, for proof that where you came from didn't determine where you could go. Raudonikis was the enforcer of that identity. Before games, he would slap his teammates in the face, not playfully, hard enough to leave marks, hard enough that some players would flinch when they saw him coming. The goal was to induce a hyper-aggressive state, to strip away any hesitation, and to make sure that when they ran onto the field, they weren't thinking about tactics. They were thinking about revenge. This approach worked. The Magpies won the 1978 Minor Premiership and the 1977 Amco Cup. They sold out stadiums. Fans came to watch the carnage as much as the football. The atmosphere was electric. People who had never been to a game started showing up just to see what the fuss was about. But they also earned a reputation that stuck. Critics started calling the sport Thugby League. The physical aggression was so extreme that it overshadowed the skill. Parents stopped letting their kids play. Sponsors got nervous. League officials worried the sport was becoming too violent to survive. And here's the contradiction that defines Tommy. In 1972, referees voted him the best and fairest player in the competition and awarded him the Rothmans Medal. The same man who was slapping faces and starting brawls was also being judged as the most disciplined player on the field. That tells you he wasn't just a thug. He was a tactical genius who chose violence as his primary tool because he understood it worked better than anything else. People forget that Raudonikis was an elite halfback. He played 201 games for Western Suburbs and 37 for Newtown. He represented Australia 29 times and was the first choice halfback for the entire 1970s. That kind of longevity doesn't happen by accident. He could read a game better than almost anyone. He knew when to kick, when to run, when to slow the tempo, and when to speed it up. He could execute under pressure when the entire stadium was screaming and the opposition was hunting him, and he was mentally tougher than anyone else on the field. He never showed fear, never backed down, never gave an inch. But his reputation was built on stories, not statistics. And the stories were insane. When he became a coach, the folklore only got worse. At Campbelltown, his team was losing badly at halftime. The players were deflated, heads down, beaten before the second half even started. He walked into the dressing room, grabbed a shovel, and smashed the windows. Glass everywhere. Players frozen in shock. Some thought he'd lost his mind. Then he told them to get back out there and play like they had something to prove. It was reckless. It was property damage. It could have gotten him fired. But the players later gave him a Braveheart photo with a blue-painted face and a shovel because they believed it worked. They came out in the second half and played with an intensity they didn't know they had. The crowd noticed the shift. The opposition couldn't match it. Before the 1990 Brisbane Rugby League Grand Final, he brought an ox heart into the dressing room, an actual ox heart, dripping blood. He held it up in front of the players and told them this was what they needed. He told his players they needed to have a bigger heart than the opposition. Some players touched it, some kissed it. Players ran onto the field with blood on their jerseys. The opposition saw them coming and knew something had shifted. They lost by 1 point, but they were 1,000,000-1 underdogs. Raudonikis later admitted he wasn't the greatest coach and that he had to try things because he didn't have the systems other coaches had. He didn't have the budgets. He didn't have the facilities. He didn't have the star players. What he had was the ability to make players believe they were capable of more than they actually were. And those rituals became part of the sport's permanent memory. The most famous story is the cattle dog call. In 1997, Raudonikis was coaching New South Wales in State of Origin. Game 3. The Blues were under pressure. Queensland had the momentum. The crowd was roaring. The Maroons were executing their game plan perfectly, and New South Wales was on the verge of collapse. The scoreboard was moving the wrong way. The players looked defeated, so Tommy gave the order. A trainer ran onto the field and whispered one word to the players. Cattle dog. That was the trigger. Mark Spud Carroll punched Craig Smith square in the face. The entire field erupted. Players from both teams sprinting in from every angle. Andrew Johns, the future immortal, got into a brutal fight with Jamie Goddard, fists flying, jerseys ripped. Johns took 27 stitches from his lip to his nose. He was concussed, blood pouring down his face. The doctor tried to pull him off the field, but Johns refused. And Raudonikis told him to get back out there. Johns went back on. That's the no boundaries philosophy. It wasn't a spontaneous brawl. It was planned. The cattle dog was a tactical reset button. When the game was slipping away, Tommy would trigger chaos to disrupt Queensland's rhythm. It worked in the sense that it stopped the Maroons' momentum. The crowd went silent. The officials were scrambling. The entire match had changed in seconds. But it also became the defining example of everything wrong with his coaching style. Sending a concussed player back onto the field is indefensible by modern standards. It's the kind of decision that ends careers and ruins lives. But in 1997, it was seen as toughness. It was seen as what you had to do to win. It was seen as the price of glory. When the legends of the game talk about Tom Raudonikis, you hear two completely different stories depending on who's speaking. And the order matters, because some of them saw the chaos firsthand, while others tried to replace it with professionalism. Number 5. Ben Elias was a hard man himself, a hooker who thrived on agitation and mind games. He understood what it took to get under an opponent's skin. For Elias, the positive was simple. The enforcer role that Tommy perfected was tactically valid. It won games. It intimidated opponents. It gave average teams a psychological edge they wouldn't have had otherwise. You could take a team with less skill and turn them into winners if you could make the opposition afraid. But the negative was just as clear. The personal toll was massive. Elias saw what happened to Andrew Johns after the cattle dog incident. 27 stitches and a concussion, and he was sent back out. That's not coaching. That's sacrifice. That's treating players like disposable weapons. And Elias, working as a media commentator, has debated whether the cattle dog mentality was a necessary evil to beat Queensland's dominance, or whether it was just reckless leadership that put players at risk for no reason other than to satisfy a coach's ego. Number 4. Wally Lewis experienced the Raudonikis doctrine as a target. The king of Queensland Rugby League was constantly mocked, chirped at, and physically intimidated by the Blues under Tommy's leadership. Lewis's negative perspective was that Raudonikis showed no respect. He used jibes and ridicule to destabilize the Maroons. He'd call them soft, question their courage, make jokes about their families. The 1980 State of Origin, the very first one, was captained by Raudonikis, and he set the tone for years of hatred between the two states. It wasn't friendly rivalry. it was genuine animosity. Players from both sides genuinely disliked each other because of the seeds Tommy planted. But the positive came later. When Tommy passed away, Lewis and other Queenslanders admitted that the rivalry forced them to elevate their game. They had to meet the physical challenge that Raudonikis brought. They had to become tougher, meaner, and more committed than they ever thought possible. And even though they were on the receiving end of his ridicule, they respected the passion he had for the jersey. That respect was earned through violence, but it was real. Number 3, Andrew Voss provides the media's perspective, and it's overwhelmingly positive. To Voss, Raudonikis was an absolute immortal, not because of his stats, but because of his character. Voss saw him as a knockabout labourer, a larrikin, the nicest tough guy you'd ever meet. He was genuine. He didn't put on an act for the cameras. He could get away with anything because people believed he meant it. There was no pretense. But here's the problem. Voss's perspective tends to downplay the thuggery. He treats the violence as essential Australian traits, the mark of a true Aussie. And that itself is part of the debate. By celebrating the chaos without acknowledging the harm, Voss represents the half of rugby league that refuses to let go of the past. The half that thinks the game was better when blood was part of the entertainment. Number 2, Peter Sterling was the Silvertail, the Parramatta Eels star who defeated Raudonikis' Newtown Jets in the 1981 Grand Final. That match symbolised the victory of modern structured play over raw grit and determination. Sterling's negative perspective came from playing against a man whose primary goal was physical neutralisation, not skill contests. It's frustrating to face someone who's trying to hurt you instead of outplay you. Every tackle was late, every ruck was dirty, every play the ball was an opportunity for intimidation. But Sterling's positive view recognises Raudonikis as a mentor to younger halfbacks, and a leader whose impact on struggling clubs like Newtown was impossible to imagine. He saw both sides, the nightmare opponent and the respected teammate, the man who would break your ribs and then buy you a beer after the game. Number 1, Wayne Bennett represents the future that replaced the Raudonikis model. Bennett built his coaching career on statisticians, trainers, and clinical systems. He pioneered incremental gains and psychological stability. He turned coaching into a science. The negative from Bennett's camp is that Raudonikis lacked tactical sophistication. He relied on old-fashioned passion, ox hearts, and shovels instead of data. For Bennett, coaching is about preparation, analysis, and marginal improvements. For Raudonikis, it was emotional outbursts and physical intimidation. It was making players so angry they forgot to be scared. But even Bennett acknowledged the positive. Raudonikis could unite teams under a shared sense of defiance. That's a quality you can't measure with modern metrics, but it's real, and it worked. When your back was against the wall, when everyone had written you off, Tommy could make you believe you had a chance. And then there's Ray Warren, the voice of rugby league. Warren saw Raudonikis as the ultimate personification of the sport's tribal roots. His positive perspective emphasized character and larrikinism. Tommy's aggression was a necessary component of the game's entertainment value in the 1970s and 80s. People came to watch him as much as they came to watch the football. But Warren also witnessed the transition away from those methods. His negative view was that while Raudonikis was one of a kind, his specific brand of warfare was a relic of a past that the modern NRL had outgrown. The passion and authenticity were undeniable. The difficulty in reconciling that authenticity with modern professional standards was just as undeniable. You can't sell the sport to families and sponsors when the highlight reel includes pre-game face slapping and coded brawl triggers. After retirement, Raudonikis became a media figure. He hosted Tommy's Tirade and commercialized the Cattle Dog brand. He championed a version of Australian masculinity that was good, old school, working class, and no nonsense. He told players to harden up, to stop complaining, to play through pain. He became the voice of everyone who thought the modern game had gone soft. His segments were controversial but wildly popular. People tuned in to hear him tear into the new generation of players who he felt were too protected, too pampered, too afraid of contact. But that era also generated criticism. People felt he was glorifying a dangerous and outdated past. The term Thugby League came back. Critics argued that the pre-game face-slapping and cattle dog stories were damaging the sport's efforts to attract new families and participants. Youth rugby league numbers were dropping. Insurance costs were rising. The game was at a crossroads between honouring its history and protecting its future. But media figures like Paul Murray defended him. They said he represented a type of masculinity that was being unfairly frowned upon by modern judges of appropriateness. The tension between thug and legend remained unresolved until the end. Tommy himself said, "You can't do that today, but today's today." He understood the game had changed. He just preferred the older, more violent version. His battles with cancer and major heart surgery were fought with the same intensity he brought to the field. The harden up philosophy wasn't just for rugby league. It was how he lived his life. He refused chemotherapy at first because he thought it was weak. He eventually accepted treatment but never stopped fighting. Even in his final days, he remained defiant. Tom Raudonikis was the last of the hard men. From the migrant camps of Cowra to the cattle dog brawls of the 1990s, he was permanently terrifying to his opponents and unequivocally crucial to his clubs. For Wayne Bennett and Peter Sterling, he was a challenge to the evolution of professionalism. For Andrew Voss and Ray Warren, he was a necessary larrikin who kept the sport connected to its tribal, working-class roots. The cattle dog philosophy and the ox heart rituals are incompatible with the modern NRL, but they remain essential chapters in the history of how the game was won and lost in the late 20th century. His legacy is both immortal and complicated. He redefined what it meant to compete, and he did it in a way that can never be repeated. He made teams believe they could win through sheer will, and sometimes that belief was enough. The debate about whether he was good for the game or bad for it will never end, and maybe that's exactly how he would have wanted it. If you want more stories like this, hit subscribe, leave a comment, and I'll see you in the next one.